Okay, now I'm going to introduce tonight's moderator, Perry Halkitis, who has a book coming out this fall from Oxford University Press, The AIDS Generation, Stories of Survival and Resilience, which examines the life experience of gay men who are long-term survivors of HIV and AIDS, so that's perfect. Perry is the professor of applied psychology, public health, and medicine, and director of the Center for Health, Identity, Behavior, and Prevention Studies at New York University. Perry.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for being here. I know no adult life without AIDS. All of the gay men of my generation, infected or not, are long-term survivors of this disease. We were all affected by AIDS as we emerged into adulthood, trying to avoid a termination to our existences at the prime of our lives. Yet, like a subset of these men who became infected early in the epidemic and remained vibrant and healthy 30 years later, all of us, my generation, have survived this plague, battle-scarred, but also resilient and stronger individually and as a community. It has been said that Americans who served in World War II are the greatest generation. I say that my generation, who came into their own in the 1970s and 1980s and were decimated by AIDS, are instead the bravest generation. I know it. I know it because I lived it. There are several adjectives that I can use to describe what I'm feeling tonight. First, I'm thrilled that I had the opportunity to share that opening section of my book with you. I am amazed and in awe that I am standing here at age 50. But mostly, I am proud and honored to be in your company tonight and to be moderating this forum. My task this evening as moderator is to keep us moving and on schedule and to keep us focused. I imagine no easy task. The evening will consist of two sections. First, we will hear brief comments from each of our panelists who will then engage in a discussion of the ideas they have shared. In the second half of the evening, the floor is yours, as we open up the discussion to hear your ideas, thoughts, comments, or questions. We all hope that this conversation that we know has been occurring among many of us in many different contexts will continue way beyond tonight's forum, as together we figure out how to best address the needs, hopes, and rights of our generation, the AIDS generation. So with that, let's begin. Our first presenter, our first panelist is Peter Staley. Peter Staley has been a long-term AIDS and gay rights activist, first as a member of ACT UP New York, then as a founding director of the Treatment Action Group. He is the founder of AIDSmed.com, an educational website for people living with HIV. Welcome, Peter Staley.
This all started for many of us on that Tuesday morning in December, 3 days before Spencer was making a seemingly strong recovery, and we thought he was out of the woods. Then everything went to shit, and we all rushed to the hospital none of us had ever heard of at the very tip of Manhattan. Spencer Cox was one of the youngest of ACT UP's alumni, and his death at only 44 sent a shockwave to all of us. Not just the current and former activists, but our generation, our AIDS generation, men and women, positive and negative. A huge and largely healthy discussion ensued, with long phone calls, dinners with friends we hadn't seen in recent years, Facebook threads, blog postings, and even a long article in a Sunday New York Times. A kind of bubble had burst. What did this say about us? How are we doing now? How are we treating each other? Is there a community that even cares about us? The memorial was beautiful. It was funny, campy, moving, a little trashy at times, tearful, and even sexy. Thank you, David Drake. But most of all, it felt communal. in a way many of us miss dearly. After a short break, some of Spencer's friends formed the Medius working group to see if there were ways to highlight the issues he often raised in his final years. TAG is working with Dr. Judith Rabkin at Columbia University on a possible study, hoping to survey a couple hundred former AIDS activists in an attempt to quantify how we're doing. Alan Klein has organized some ACT UP alumni that hope to pull off a series of regular reunions structured as social events. And tonight is for some much-needed venting. For purists who always want narrowly defined discussion points with clearly defined goals, tonight is probably not your night. It's too early in this process to say assuredly these are our issues. I'm sure a lot of this discussion will be about our challenges and grievances. I know I've got some to share. As I said at Spencer's Memorial, many of us in some way have unprocessed grief or guilt and an overwhelming sense of abandonment from a gay community that turned its back on us and increasingly stigmatizes us, all in an attempt to pretend that AIDS isn't its problem anymore. Many of us see our national gay rights groups and our gay foundations and our big gay money focused entirely on the feel-good battle for marriage equality. As worthy as that battle is, aren't we shooting ourselves in the foot with this singular focus? Silence may no longer equal death on the scale it once did, but it's certainly feeding an alarming rise of HIV infections in young gay men, especially in apparently easy-to-ignore young gay men of color. Where are they in these happy marriage pictures? So yes, let's discuss these feelings of abandonment, or unprocessed grief, or loneliness, or addiction, but let's also recognize our strengths and what we've overcome, our resilience. I'm fascinated by the brilliant work of Dr. Ron Stahl from the University of Pittsburgh, who's been studying the health of gay men for many years. He writes a lot about syndemics, a group of epidemics interacting synergistically to lower the overall health profile of a population. So he studies the burdens and the fallouts a lot, including the self-loathing we are taught as kids or living through the plague years. But what amazes him the most is our resilience through all this. It's the glass half full metaphor. Yes, let's examine the empty half and the reasons behind it, but let's also acknowledge our pool of strengths. Where does this resilience come from, and can we build on it? Thanks for turning out tonight. I'm really honored to be on this panel and hope the conversation we start here with all of you will continue in the months ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Dr. Mark Brennan-Ing is the Director for Research and Evaluation at the AIDS Community Research Initiative of America. Mark's work has focused on mental health, social supports, and resilience among older adults with HIV. Please welcome Mark.
Thank you, Perry. Thank you, and it's really an honor to be part of this panel tonight. I'm here as a researcher, so I'm going to largely be talking about research on aging with HIV. And we know a lot more about this today than we did even a few years ago, because the research is expanding, and a lot of it's been very medically focused, but there has been much greater attention to psychological and emotional issues that affect care and treatment outcomes. Perry has done a great study called the GOLD study. Korea has done the ROA study, Research on Older Adults with HIV, which many of you heard about. And what I'll be talking about today are data primarily from that ROA study, which was a 1,000-person cohort of people 50 and older living with HIV in New York City, as well as a study we did at GMHC a few years ago on 180 HIV-positive adults who were also 50 and older. Most of these people are relatively long-term survivors. We were talking a little bit, there's no real good definition of what a long-term survivor is. But for example, most of these folks have been living 12 or more years since diagnosis. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about people who are newly infected over the age of 50 and what issues they may be facing. These long-term survivors are evidencing considerable resilience, as Peter has spoken about, despite some of the problems they face around health, employment, and housing. So today I'd like to talk to you about some of these problems and challenges, but also the resilience part of that and how that fits in terms of coping and adapting to this. You'll be hearing from Dr. Bookhart Murray in a few minutes about some of the health issues in more detail. But one of the consistent findings we've had is that for a lot of people growing older with HIV, they're dealing with a lot of other comorbid health conditions in addition to the HIV infection. And we find about 3 other conditions on average. And this has been consistent with many studies we've done as well as studies that have been done elsewhere. But getting now to the psychological issues, the most prevalent comorbidity that we uncover is depression. And over half the people in the ROA study talked about depression as a problem. When we did a more formal assessment of that, we found that 2/3 of this group had moderate to severe levels of depressive symptoms. And this is nearly 5 times the rate that we see in the community. What contributes to this? Well, a past history of depression, as well as having health problems. Having health problems is one of the best predictors of being depressed. There are other factors, though. We see very high lifetime and current rates of substance use, particularly alcohol. That is really the substance of choice, as well as high levels of loneliness and stigma, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We're concerned that depression isn't better managed in a population who is engaged with the healthcare system in terms of getting their antiretrovirals. So we don't understand this. Is this structural barriers? Is this reluctance to take additional medication? But we really need to address this problem of depression because that's the single biggest predictor of being non-adherent to medication and not being engaged in care, which is going to lead to much poorer health outcomes. Turning to some of these other issues, such as loneliness and stigma, they present problems but also evidence of resilience. So when we talk about loneliness, this is not the same thing as social isolation, but it's very closely related. For example, in the ROA study, we find very high levels of loneliness. We also find about 1/3 of the people in that study were extremely socially isolated. And this isolation is fueled by stigma in terms of rejection, but also people will isolate in a self-protective way to get away from the stigma. So it's kind of really a toxic mix here of depression, stigma, and loneliness. And loneliness in and of itself is a risk factor. We know that when we talk to clients, one of the biggest things they want are socialization opportunities. They feel, I talked to one client at GMHC and he was telling me, you know, I come here for the programs every day, but I really don't have any friends here. I need to make friends and I need to make them outside of the world of HIV. We see resilience, though, in terms of the social networks, because even though there's been a lot of rejection from family, a lot of dissociation, people who are growing older with HIV have constructed their own social networks, these so-called families of choice or chosen families, which we see very commonly in the LGBT community. Many of these friends, however, are also HIV positive, and they may be limited in their ability to provide assistance and support as time goes on. Just wrapping up, the last thing I'd like to talk, though, is about a personal resilience factor in terms of spirituality. And here specifically, I'm talking about spirituality in terms of having a purpose and meaning in life, a feeling of being able to transcend your immediate problems, feeling that you have inner resources that you can draw on, and also feeling connectedness to other people, connectedness to the world. And we find that high levels of spirituality in people who are growing older with this virus, and furthermore, we find that this spirituality is extremely protective in terms of psychological distress. And that many of this group are engaged with religious congregations despite the considerable stigma they face there. And even if they haven't disclosed to people in the congregation, we find that they're still going to services and they're still engaged. So as I'm running out of time, just to sum this up, despite these challenges, we find that people who are growing older with HIV have considerable psychological resources to draw on and social resources to draw on. And that's very encouraging in terms of growing older. And while these challenges are unique in some ways, they're very similar to what we see in terms of other people who are struggling with illness and other people who are growing older. And we really feel that we could do a lot if we can open up mainstream services, but services that are accessible to all adults. They should be accessible to adults with HIV as well, and we're working very hard to try and make that happen. So how do we forge these connections? How do we prepare these providers? I'd like to hear something from you when we get to that point, so thank you.
Sorry. I got aroused there for a second. Dr. Janine Bookhart-Murray has been the Chief Medical Officer for Harlem United Community AIDS Center for the last 8 years. Janine is also a consultant to the New York State Department of Health AIDS Institute, where she assists with the development of HIV/AIDS clinical guidelines for primary care providers. Please welcome Janine.
Thank you, Perry. Good evening. And it is an honor to be sitting at the table with these men. I grew up in Denver, and I left Denver because I vowed in my heart that I wanted to go to a city and help people who look like me, who I felt weren't getting the kind of care that they needed. And I ended up at Harlem Hospital. I have remained in Harlem for all these years, going on 30 years now. But one of the things that a young doctor is prepared to do is they're trained and prepared to save lives. But as a young doctor, I ended up in a place where I could do nothing. And it touched me very deeply. Sometimes I wanted to run away, but there was nowhere to go. And so I got to know my patients very well, the ones who could talk. I would sit at their bedside, I would get their stories, I would write them on 3x5 cards. I never wanted to forget any one of them. And I was greatly moved by each one of them. We fought around the clock trying to fight against something that we didn't quite understand. And I'm grateful to the activists who tirelessly pushed through and agitated and got treatment into our hands. And I think of my friends and my patients and family members who died just months before the cocktails came out, and I still wonder in my mind, why couldn't they just have held on? It seems that we've moved on to a new phase in life. We have life-saving cocktails. We hit the turning point, people are living longer. I thought by now we would have a cure. In fact, I have always said I want to see two things during my lifetime. One, a cure for AIDS, and two, a black president. I never thought that I would see it in the order I have seen it. So here we are. So I'm not going to go into a monologue about all the health issues that we see as people get older, but I do want to say that around the age of 45 years, the body begins to reveal its wear and tear. A few aches here and there. You think you're walking fast. This just happened to me the other day. Boy, I was walking for that train and I was hitting it, and this young person just kind of glided by me, and I was like, what? And I couldn't catch up with him. So, you think you're walking fast, you realize maybe you're not walking as fast as you thought you were. I don't know. And, then it seems that young people mumble. They mumble all the time. And then you say, uh-oh, maybe it's not them, maybe it's me, maybe it's time to go get my hearing checked. Then there's the gray hair and the balding and the flab that was never there before. And we become overwhelmed by our physiological and bodily changes. And sometimes it's a little hard to deal with because we just came out of this phase where we saw so many people die. And we lived through a heroic time when ACT UP and other organizations and activists pressed through and got treatment, and we saw life-saving cocktails. But now here we are. Our friends and family who've died, we're years beyond, and we're still dealing with other issues that we must confront. And it can get a little overwhelming. When you go to your doctor, do you really have to take that blood pressure medicine, the glaucoma drops, the diabetes medication, and that acid reflux? I mean, do we really need to do the mammograms and the colonoscopies and the prostate exam? Then there's hepatitis B and hepatitis C. I mean, haven't we been through enough already? But it seems that the longer we live, the more we need to grapple with. And we've been through a lot. We've survived loss. I lost family members. I lost colleagues. I lost countless patients. I've pushed it to the back of my mind, and every once in a while it pops out. And tonight is one of those nights where every face is flooding through my mind. Can't we just go on and live a normal life? Well, we're here today because we have fought to accept the past. We've gotten beyond the loss and still getting beyond the loss. And we understand that as long as we grow older, there is something that we can't escape. ACT UP, GMHG, other activist groups cannot keep us from aging. Our circles are coming full circle to acceptance of self and the world. We're in an era where life-saving cocktails have preserved many, thank God. Pre-exposure prophylaxis is now available. Hallelujah. Post-exposure treatment is readily available. I am so grateful. These are conversations that we need to be having with each other during this time of HIV infection. Hep C treatments are improving, and hopefully within the next couple of years, we'll get more people on life-saving Hep C treatments. What I'm trying to say is that we have many reasons to be happy to be here. We have many reasons to be happy to get older. And we owe it all to those we have lost. We owe it to them to take care of ourselves. We owe it to them to live life to the fullest extent. And we've endured, and we will continue to endure. We are at a time in life where we understand that greatness in changing what can be changed is good. And we accept what we cannot change, but always be on the lookout for what can be changed. So I want to ask you to take care of yourselves. I will, you'll open it up for questions later on, and we can talk specifically about ailments. Okay, thank you.
I need these. Should I blow in the microphone again? No. Okay. So our next panelist is Jim Igo. Jim has written on theater, dance, art, literature, sex, and the design of clinical trials. He is an architect of 2 reforms of AIDS drug regulation, expedited approval, and expanded access that have helped bring treatments to countless people living with HIV. Welcome, Jim.
Hi, mine is personal. It's political, it's a story, and I can only get it in 5 minutes if I go fast. 1989 was a remarkably successful year for ACT UP's treatment activism. We forced the Food and Drug Administration to approve the blindness drug DHPG. We released ACT UP's treatment agenda at the International AIDS Conference in Montreal. We secured the federal bureaucracy's approval for a program to release investigational AIDS drugs outside clinical trials to patients with no treatment options, then persuaded Bristol-Myers to provide its drug DDI for the program's prototype. By the end of the year, I, with no more science credentials than 2 years of work with ACT UP, had been named to panels of the Institute of Medicine, the National Institutes of Health, and the National AIDS Program Office, a White House-level appointment. This should have been a time of personal satisfaction and of pride in ACT UP, my only home in the plague years, a community of individuals I'd grown to love and work with almost around the clock, but mostly I felt overwhelmed. I came to ACT UP, a gay man steeped in the downtown arts scene. AIDS had already picked off thousands in my neighborhood, my profession, and among my kind. But in its first couple of years, ACT UP suffered remarkably little death. Early in 1988, Peter Staley declared to ACT UP's coordinating committee that AIDS activism was a cofactor in his continued health and that of other HIV-positive ACT UP members. For months, we repeated Peter's contention among ourselves, like we were trying to cast a spell. If we all said it often enough, in the face of mounting death all around us, it would have to prove true, wouldn't it? It would not. Over a several-week period in late 1989 and early 1990, the disease claimed the lives of 4 close ACT UP colleagues, John Bone, Dr. Nathaniel Peer, Clark Taylor, and the downtown visual and performing artist Brian Damage. Months earlier, when Brian had been hospitalized for several grueling weeks, I'd visited him daily, bathed him and shaved him, more intimate than sex and therapy for us both. I was not there for Brian in the same way during his final hospitalization in November, commuting as I was between New York City and suburban DC. Brian died on the day he was to sign power of attorney over to me, like he timed it to spare me one more burden. Before I could deal with any one death, the next one hit. But there was a worsening epidemic to fight. We were making clear headway now, so we had to move on. Other AIDS organizations helped people die. We in ACT UP were street fighters, clawing for every last life, a useful activist stance. But once the dying hit ACT UP, all the more ferocious for having been denied, we had no activist way to make peace with all that loss. And our very activism meant we'd bond with a fresh batch of colleagues in battle-like situations, only to lose an ungodly number of them as well. In How to Survive a Plague, Peter Staley wonders why he came home from a war that took so many others. We who are HIV negative contend with a second question, rooted in a second level of survivor's guilt. Not only did we not die, we never had to deal daily in a personal, physical way with the infection that had torn us from our earlier lives. The small group of ACT UP members that in late 1987 began the hardcore work of developing the critique of AIDS clinical research were, surprisingly, HIV negative. But by 1990, a large part of the core of the 50-strong treatment and data community was HIV positive. Sitting on all those federal panels, I started feeling uncomfortable, even fraudulent, for taking a constituent's place, though not personally dealing with HIV infection. I decided to refuse reappointment to committees I sat on and decline fresh offers. In 1992, ACT UP splintered, no longer the home it had been. We who were HIV negative were free to walk away from the fight, and we did in droves. On and off, I did the same, but it's not that simple. In Survive, Spencer Cox articulates one HIV-positive man's nightmare. Will the last gay man in Chelsea turn out the light? In my HIV-negative nightmare, more and more of you got sick and died, leaving fewer and fewer of us behind, baffled, uselessly uninfected, unable to do much with the rest of our lives, but wonder what in hell hit. Of course, you didn't all die. That's why it's so great seeing so many of you here tonight. Considering what we've been through, I think we all look pretty good. For those of you who are veterans of ACT UP, there will be another occasion for us to tell each other how good we look. There's a non-reunion of ACT UP alumni slated to take place on June 22nd. You can find details at actupnyalumni.org, and my personal email is jimigo@aol.com. I'd love to hear any survivor's story, activist or not, and thanks for listening to mine.
Thank you, Jim. Jesus Aguais, a native of Venezuela, founded Aid for AIDS International, an organization which focuses on providing access to antiretroviral treatment to people with HIV in developing countries. Aid for AIDS International is now the largest recycling program of HIV medication in the world. Welcome, Jesus.
Thank you. Well, I guess I'm the Latino in the house. My life with HIV became who I am. I was 20 years old when I was diagnosed. That was back in 1988. So the invitation to this panel made me realize that I'm a middle-aged man. I have to deal with that after all this is over. Back in '88, and when I got my diagnosis, that was actually the first time I heard the word HIV. And back then in Venezuela, people only talk about AIDS as the devastating disease that were killing gay men in the US, and they were dying from that. So it's been a long journey. 20 years old, a college kid in a place that not even knew about HIV, I said I had to get out of here. So I came to New York. What better place than New York? Well, that was part of the denial. Not facing what was happening to me, I want to escape. I thought if I leave Venezuela, I would leave HIV behind, AIDS behind. But I didn't. I moved here, and a year and a half later, somebody invited me to an ACT UP meeting. That was in the early 90s. I didn't speak any English. Well, I still don't, but you know, I didn't really speak any English back then. And it was fascinating. I walked into the ACT UP meeting, and I met all the Latinos, the Latino caucus, and they embraced me. Not understanding what was happening, I knew I belonged. And it was an awakening experience when your political mind wakes up, you know, in a non-formal sense of political party. I knew that in that room something amazing was happening, And something amazing started happening inside of me. I was very shy. You know, I remember Peter and all the guys, and they were like, oh, the big guys, and you know, you shy, you don't speak a language, you're trying to navigate a system. But soon enough, I realized there was a place for me in New York. So I was not the only immigrant. There was plenty of them. And my friends from Caracas moved right after me to the city. And in my early 20s, I lost 4 of my friends. So while seeing what was happening with people with HIV and AIDS dying every single day, I have my own death. My friends were dying, but their family could not come see them dying. So I have to organize the community, our Latino communities, to be with them. And not only that, is to bring them back home. Myself, I brought 4 friends' ashes back to their native countries in Venezuela. So that really shaped, you know, it's fucked up your head. You know, you're not supposed to go through that when you're 20. But not only that, you're also dealing with immigration issues. You're also trying to fit in a society that you don't really understand. You know, you're afraid to speak up because you're not from here. And, you know, and then it became a very, very straightforward situation. But at the end, what I was learning on those hallways of the ACT UP meetings, it started making sense. And in '96, I started collecting HIV medications. At that time, I ended up going to college here. I started working at St. Vincent Hospital. And I remember a lot of people were collecting medicines to send it abroad. In '96, especially foreigners, you know, we have a sense of the world is bigger than New York and the US, and you know, I lived there in '88, so I knew there was no medicine in my native country. So working at St. Vincent's HIV clinic, people started switching the medicine. Because remember in '96, there was 2 protease inhibitors that came out at the time. That was Norvir and Quinavir. And each one of them came with a set of side effects. And somehow in '96, there was a lot of medicine going around. Collecting it, something happened. To somebody who came to New York looking for medicine for that was the mother, her son and daughter-in-law both had AIDS, and I sent it to them. And long story short, and we collected information from them, you know, do they have a doctor, who prescribed the medicine. And that model back then, I didn't know what I was doing. It became the largest HIV redistribution program in the world right now. So who gave me a sense of why I'm here? Why did I make it? Why I didn't die when my friends were gone in the early '90s? Then I got invited to be part of this panel. I got a phone call from Peter, and I was very pleased. You know, now he's a superstar. So I said, wow. Peter's calling me. That was really good, really great. And obviously now I run an organization, we have offices, and the focus is Latin America. We work with Latino immigrants in New York. We have offices in several Latin American countries. And we do prevention, access to treatment, and advocacy. But 2 things happened after the phone call from Peter. I realized after 1996, I stopped talking about myself. So I became an executive director. I became a fundraiser. But I would never, ever, until that conversation, really took me to myself to say, who am I now? And I started asking questions. And then I said, what's happening with Latino immigrants, long-term survivors? How do we define long-term survivors? I was asking people, what does it really mean? I remember in 2001, in an ACT UP meeting, they had a panel, that was early 90s, 91, 92, 93. That was a long-term survival panel. I wasn't a long-term survivor back then in '92, and back then, the definition was they were alive despite any, data at that moment. You were supposed to die 12 years after diagnosis. So it took me to the question now, what is long-term survival? So what I did, I met with my team, and I said, well, let's do a focus group. I want long-term survivors, and my definition of long-term survivors was people who was diagnosed before the protease inhibitors came out. Immigrants who were uninsured, have no access to health care. So we collected data from 12 people, and then I did another focus group. I said, well, I want to see how what we see in New York with the immigrants is translated in Latin America. So I called 12 AIDS activists, long-term survivors from 8 different Latin American countries. So I did an interview, and then we look at the information. And it was really astonishing, because the data was very, very similar. What immigrants faces in New York is very similar what they face in Latin America, from emotional issues, relationship issues, disclosure issues, but mostly isolation. When I asked, one of the last question was, what do you know about people like you who's been diagnosed prior to 1996? And 100% of the people said absolutely nothing. We don't talk about that. How people has been diagnosed for so long, and we just became sheltering ourselves. We don't talk about what had happened to us for all these years. So that's what I'm very pleased, and I'm gonna close by inviting to continue this conversation, and hopefully we can also start some fund to support AIDS activists to go through their life. There's a lot of AIDS activists that could not make it like we did, a lot of us did, could not go on with their life. They emotionally sheltered, they emotionally blocked. They very smart people that need support. And I hope we can continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesus. Our last panelist is Joe Jervis. Joe is the author of Joe My God, the popular LGBT news and culture blog, and one of the top 100 most widely read political blogs in America. Joe's writing has also been published in Pride magazine and many other LGBT publications. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks everybody. First of all, I want to say that I'm very flattered to be here on this panel with people whose credentials far exceed my own. They asked me to give a bit of background for those who, hopefully few of you who don't read my site. I started Joe My God 9 years ago, essentially after I got kicked off of Manhunt. Because instead of saying I am this and you should be that, I was writing little vignettes, short stories. I thought they were funny. Other people thought they were funny. Started getting passed around to places outside New York City, and finally Manhunt wrote to me and said, you know, you should really start a blog. So the first few years of the blog were fairly much entirely devoted to stories about the plague years. And that was because I had got it into my head that if I didn't get these stories out there, if I didn't get things down into digital ink, I was going to forget them. I was going to forget the people, what was said, who was there, when it happened, how it happened. And so these days I'm more known as a political blogger, and that's probably how most of you came to my site if you did. But in the early years, that's pretty much exclusively what I wrote about. And when they invited me to be here tonight, they didn't know that I happen to have a book about AIDS survivorship coming out at the end of July. And it's called Nobody's Supposed to Be Here. And yes, I took that title from the Deborah Cox disco song. And I got to tell her that in person last week. So I'm just going to read a couple very short excerpts from the coming book. if you'll allow me. And the first one, a little bit of backstory. I was one of a group of caregivers for a dear friend of ours in San Francisco. And one of the guys in our group was a shrink, and he suggested that I start a journal sort of as self-therapy, rather than trying to deal with what we were all going through together. And so a few years ago, I pulled that handwritten journal out, and I distilled about 200 entries down into 10 sentences, which, to my mind, sort of described the arc of what we went through with our friend Daniel Johnson, from diagnosis to the end. And it's called I Will Hold You 10 Times. 1, I will hold you, Daniel. 2, I will pretend nothing is wrong when you want me to pretend, and when you need me to hold you, I will hold you. 3, I will ride with you on the train to your doctor's office, and when the fear makes you sick in the station, I will hold you. 4, the lesions don't bother me. I will hold you. 5, I'll make plans with you to go to your favorite faraway places that we both know you can no longer go, and I'll sit with you and look at pictures of those places, and I'll hold you. 6, I'll go to Safeway with you because you need to get out into the world, and when the diarrhea overwhelms you and you shit your pants in the middle of the store, I'll call us a cab, and in the cab, I will hold you. 7, I'll make you mixtapes of our favorite songs from last summer, just like you asked me to, and when the memories make you angry instead of happy and you throw the tapes in the trash, I won't get mad. I will hold you. 8, I'll see the Post-it notes you put all over the house, reminding yourself to do everyday things like turn off stove and lock front door, and I'll pretend the disease isn't robbing your mind, and when you tell me something for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, I won't let you know. I'll hold you. 9, I'll sit up with you all night because the fevers and night sweats won't let you sleep, and in the morning I'll change your drenched sheets and help you out of the shower, and when you weep from the sight of your withered body in the mirror on the bathroom door, I will hold you. 10, I will hold you, Daniel, always. Thanks. This next one, it's not so grim, hopefully. It's called 2 Muddy Pills. Ever since his diagnosis in the mid-90s, Rob had retreated from social life. He'd stopped going to clubs, he begged off party invitations. The gay male world had divided itself into 2 hemispheres, a division exemplified in AOL profiles where the uninfected often described themselves as clean, meaning by inference that the HIV positive were dirty, dangerous, untouchable. Some positive men rebelled against this caste system, boldly announcing their status on t-shirts or with darkly humorous biohazard tattoos. But not Rob, he simply disappeared. In 1996, the FDA approved the protease inhibitor Crixivan, a drug that often caused dramatic facial wasting. This new and highly visible sign of infection could not be cloaked by hours at the gym, and men could often accurately diagnose one's status at a glance. And as they'd done with tattoos, some positive men took ownership of what had become known as, to some as the Crixivan crease. My favorite example of this was my friend who assumed the internet handle Crixie Van Chic. But Crixivan also caused many positive men to rebound spectacularly. Viral loads plummeted, energy levels rebounded, optimism soared. Rob was one of those men, and with my encouragement, he finally accepted a date set up by a mutual friend. The date started out great, with both men eagerly sharing their mutual interest in old cars and, to my mind, a rather disturbing devotion to Stephen Sondheim. After dinner, Rob and his date moved on for drinks at a posh lounge where, mistakenly believing that the other man had been made aware of his status, Rob took out his small pill box for his end-of-day Crixivan dose. Crixivan had a rather grueling dosing requirement. You weren't supposed to eat for an hour before or 2 hours after each of the 3 daily doses, which meant no food for a total of 9 waking hours every day. Rob explained that he was breaking those rules in honor of the occasion, and he downed the pills. His date watched silently, then put his drink down and walked out of the bar. Almost another year passed before Rob would again socialize, and that was only because it was Halloween, his favorite holiday. I'd gifted him with an expensive ticket to a gigantic dance party held at a cavernous warehouse where the hired security was clearly unhappy to be confronted with thousands of shirtless gay men. We took position at a centrally located bar where Rob immediately drew the interest of a nearby handsome bearded man who smiled approvingly at Rob's gladiator costume. The two repeatedly exchanged flirty looks, but Rob, still completely gun-shy, refused to go speak with him. At midnight, it was time for Rob to take his Crixivan, and from inside his pocket, he deftly tapped the pills out of their box and into his palm. He stole another look at the bearded man, who was still staring over at him. Shit, I don't want him to see me take these. I teased him. You two are already not fucking. What's the worst that's going to happen if he finds out that you pause? Is he going to not fuck you more? Rob shook his head. Just let me have this cruising fantasy for tonight, okay? I suggested taking the pills in the men's room. Rob said no. The line's a mile long and hello security is in there looking for people taking pills. I said, well, just go outside. And Rob said, what if there's no ins and outs? Hadn't thought of that. The pills remained in his hand. A moment later, a giant drag queen crashed into a bar back, sending a tray of glasses tumbling onto the bar. Rob took advantage of the distraction and casually tossed the pills towards his mouth as if they were candy. The capsules bounced off his chin and landed in a muddy puddle at the foot of the bar. Horrified, he looked over at Bearded Man, who was walking over. Bearded Man scooped the wet pills from the floor and examined them. Yuck, they're falling apart. Crixivan, right? Rob froze and could only manage a slight nod. Bearded Man smiled. I've got some in my truck if you want to take a walk. Rob turned to me questioningly and I practically shoved him. Go! I watched them head to the coat check and then disappear through the giant rubber strips that define the entrance to the warehouse. They never came back that night, but it wasn't because of any no ins and outs rule. This Halloween will be their 16th anniversary. When marriage returns to California, they plan to feature 2 muddy pills on their wedding invitation. Thank you.